We are here for the James M. and Kathleen D. Stone Lecture in Economic Inequality. Lecture made possible through the generosity of our friends, Jim and Kathy Stone. We're honored and delighted that they could be with us today. Please join me in thanking Jim and Kathy for making this afternoon possible. Our mission here at the Kennedy School is to improve public policy so people can live in societies that are safer, freer, more prosperous, and more just. Expanding economic opportunity is an important element of that mission. And economic opportunity is hindered in societies that have larger amounts of income inequality, in particular concentrations of income and wealth that are especially strong. Those concentrations not only can be damaging for economic opportunity, they can also be damaging for political processes. As the Nobel Prize-winning economist Angus Deaton has argued, quote, "The political equality that is required by democracy is always under threat from economic inequality. And the more extreme the economic inequality, the greater the threat to democracy," unquote. So at the Kennedy School and elsewhere, at Harvard, we are devoting increased attention to the challenge of economic inequality and increasing concentrations of income and wealth at the top of the distribution. In our Malcolm Wiener Center for Social Policy, the Inequality in Social Policy program is helping to bring people together from across Harvard who are focused on these issues. I think some of you in this program are here in the room. If you are a Wiener PhD scholar or a Stone PhD scholar in inequality and concentration, could you stand up so we can recognize you? We are excited by the work you are doing now and by the paths that you will forge for our societies in the years to come. We are so grateful to Jim and Kathy Stone for pushing ahead the Kennedy School's work on issues of income inequality and concentration of income and wealth. They have supported a number of you, are supporting a number of you who are here in the room. They have greatly strengthened the Inequality and Social Policy program, and they're making this lecture possible. This lecture gives us a chance to bring more attention to these issues on this campus and to contribute to a broader conversation. Last year in the first lecture, Thomas Piketty was our lecturer. Today, Emmanuel Saez is here, and Stefanie Stantcheva will facilitate a conversation with him. But to introduce them, I will turn this over to David Deming. Dave is the professor of public policy here at the Kennedy School, the director of our Malcolm Wiener Center for Social Policy. He is also a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. All around impressive and estimable character. I give you David Deming.
Thank you, Doug, for that delightful introduction. I am truly delighted to welcome our distinguished guest for the second annual James M. and Kathleen D. Stone Lecture, Professor Emmanuel Saez. Emmanuel holds the Chancellor's Professorship of Tax Policy and Public Finance and is the director of the Center for Equitable Growth at the University of California at Berkeley. His research focuses on tax policy and inequality, both from theoretical and empirical perspectives. He received his PhD in economics from that school down the road, MIT, in 1999. In 2009, he was awarded the John Bates Clark Medal, that's the Junior Nobel, if you didn't know, by the American Economic Association, and in 2010, he was awarded a MacArthur Genius Fellowship. Jointly with Thomas Piketty, he has constructed long-run historical series of income inequality in the United States. He's also the author, along with Gabriel Zucman, of the book being discussed today, The Triumph of Injustice, How the Rich Dodge Taxes and How to Make Them Pay. Their work on the economics of wealth taxation has been incredibly influential in the public discourse. Just to give you one example, Democratic presidential candidates Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have both proposed wealth taxes, and the details of these policy proposals are based directly on the work of Professor Saez and Zucman. I want to say two quick things about the importance of Emmanuel's work from my perspective. First, I think that with this book, Professor Saez and Zucman have successfully crossed the great divide from the ivory tower to actual relevance in the real world of policy, politics, and ultimately the lives of everyday Americans. As academics, the truth is that most, not all, of the work that we do will be ignored by decision makers. Some blindness to the truth we produce is inevitable, of course, but I think this is also a convenient arrangement for many of us. Too often we content ourselves by participating only in our own conversations, to building our reputations within our own insular community. We are afraid to stick our necks out, we're afraid to extrapolate, and we're afraid to be wrong. It takes true intellectual courage to write a book like this. Expertise comes with a responsibility to communicate and to inform. Saez and Zuckman are not hiding their lights under a bushel. And that should be a lesson to all of us, experts and otherwise. Second, I just want to highlight what I think is the incredible intellectual vision behind this work. The creation of important data sets like the long-run series of top incomes in the US with Piketty, or his work on distributional national accounts with Piketty and Zuckman, or his efforts to bring together similar data sources from around the world through the World Inequality database. It's just an incredible resource for all of us. I teach a large class here at HKS about economic inequality, and the conversations we have every year on this subject in the US and looking at issues around the world on the concentration of wealth, they're all made possible by Professor Saez's work. And there are thousands of classrooms all across the country having these same conversations, each of them enabled by this important scholarship. Their creation of all this new knowledge about income and wealth distribution in the US and around the world is, in my view, one of the most important contributions to economics and to public policy I've seen in my lifetime. And we owe them a debt of gratitude for that. Emmanuel's going to speak for about 40 minutes. And then we are in for a treat, because the discussion will be moderated by our very own French superstar economist, Stefanie Stantcheva. Stefanie is a professor of economics at Harvard. Her research combines theory and empirical work to study the effects of taxes and transfers on human welfare and the resulting implications for policy design. Stefanie received her PhD in economics from also that school down the road, MIT, in 2014, and she was a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows from 2014 to 2016. She's been a member of the French Council of Economic Advisors since 2018, and just this year, in 2019, she was honored as the best young French economist by Le Monde. Stefanie and Emmanuel are going to continue the conversation for another 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Emmanuel Saez to the Harvard Kennedy School.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, for this very generous introduction. So I'm delighted to be here today with you to talk about our latest book with Gabriel Zuckman, my colleague at Berkeley, The Triumph of Injustice. So let me say what are the three main novelties that we propose in the book. So first, we use our academic work to describe to the broader public how much each group pays in taxes today and over the course of history in the United States, over the 20th century. Then, after that description of taxes that we hope are accessible to the broader public, we discuss elements for a new 21st century where our hope is to reconcile globalization and progressive taxation. So if there is a message from the book, it is this, that if you really want to do progressive taxation, technological progress, globalizations are hurdles you can overcome as long as you get the design right. And beyond that, we wanted the book to be useful for the broader public, exactly as David said, to engage into tax policy. And that's why we built that website that I will describe at the end, so that people can understand taxes better and can see very easily how different tax reforms change the picture of tax progressivity in the United States, and can engage with the proposals of candidates and build their favorite tax system. So, as David said, I'm mostly known for this type of series showing the evolution of the top 1% income share over a century or more in the United States. So those are a series that I actually built with Thomas Piketty when I was a young assistant professor here at Harvard University. So this is, partly made at Harvard University, and you get that big U-shape that inequality, income concentration was high early on, it dropped dramatically, was low, and then increased enormously over the last few decades. So those were series based on reported income on individual tax returns, but reported income on individual tax returns doesn't capture all forms of income. So for example, you're a very wealthy person with your wealth tied in a business or a corporation. The corporate profits are your income, but are not going to show up on your individual tax returns unless you pay, dividends or you realize capital gains. So that's why much more recently, with Gabriel Zuckman, we built a series of income concentration that really measure full comprehensive income consistent with national accounts that really distribute the full national income across income groups. So here you have the series for the top 1%. And the key thing to note is that the U shape is similar. It's perhaps a little bit flatter, but in particular for the recent period, essentially the result that the top income share doubled from something like 10% to about 20% today remains true. But further than that, we, instead of just looking at the top 1% or 10%, we really divided income across all income groups so we can put side by side what happens, say, to the top 1% since 1978, so that's the same chart I showed you, to what happened to the bottom 50%, what we call the working class. And putting side by side those two series is really striking because you can see that the gains of the top 1% in income share of 10 points is about what the bottom 50% has lost during the same period. It went from 20 to about 12%. So in other words, our economic growth was inequitable, and the gains, the extra gains that the top 1% has made over and above, average economic growth would be sufficient to compensate fully for the losses of the bottom 50%. So we've often been criticized, you look at the top 1%, why does it matter so much? Well, here you can see, what the top 1% gains is as big as what the bottom 50%, half the population, has lost. The new data also allows us to distribute economic growth across income group, and here I want to contrast the situation in the United States in the post-war decades from 1946 to 1980, where you can see that economic growth at each income percentile was very close to the average of 2% per year per adult in real terms, except at the very top, where growth was a little bit lower. So this truly was an economy that was working for everybody, with each income group making the same gains and the same number as the macroeconomic growth. Now, look at the recent decades since 1980, and you get a totally different picture, where the macro growth is 1.4% per year per adult, but that macro growth doesn't mean anything for anybody or for any income group, except people right there, at percentile 88. The bottom, you can see, has had very low growth. So if you take the bottom 50% collectively, it's almost economic stagnation in real terms when their incomes are measured comprehensively to include everything on a pre-tax basis. And of course, then growth has accumulated at the very top, where the very upper income group have grown, like in China, at rates of 4 or 5% in real terms per person. And so this line shows you, the macro growth is 1.4, but only the top 10% gets it or gets better than that. If you average growth, instead of averaging by dollars, but averaging across people, what we call people's growth, you get a growth number that is only 0.65%. So essentially, the US economy has not worked for the bottom 50%. So I wanted to lay out those facts because we feel that they are absolutely essential to have in mind when you're going to discuss tax policy that takes from pre-tax incomes then to fund a number of public programs. Let me just end, and that's a chart that will come back to haunt us in this discussion. The share of wealth accumulating at the very top, that's the Forbes 400, and you can see a tripling, from less than 1% in 1982 to about 3.5% today. This group has gained a lot. It's very visible. There are some policy proposals, like wealth taxes on billionaires and deca-billionaires that targets them specifically, so we'll come back to this group. So now, let me describe the situation with the current US tax system. So let me do this by just showing you one picture where we've divided the population by income groups from the bottom decile, the next decile, with greater details within the top 1%, and we've distributed taxes by those groups. So we know that economy-wide, the total official number on taxes relative to national income is 28%. How do each groups, pay relative to their pre-tax income? And when you put together all taxes, state, local, and federal, we find that the US tax system looks pretty similar to a giant flat tax, where pretty much every income group pays, roughly speaking, a similar amount. There is, for sure, some progressivity. That is, the bottom pays, perhaps 25, then it goes up through the middle class and the upper middle class, and then strikingly, and that's why, widening the picture here helps, if you really look at the very top, you see some regressivity, and in particular, the top 400 that you can think about as the billionaires in the Forbes 400 list pay relative to their true economic income less, 23% we've estimated in 2018. And so how can we explain this? Here, this is the same chart, but showing you the breakdown by types of taxes. So the working class, the bottom 50%, do pay quite a bit because they pay high consumption taxes, sales, excise taxes, particularly at the state and local level, combined with pretty high payroll taxes that, as we know, start from the first dollar of earnings. So then, for sure, the individual income tax is very progressive. It's very small at the bottom, and it grows. And it hits the most, the rich, not ultra rich, but very rich people. But at the top, progressivity comes down for two reasons, essentially. First one is that, as I said earlier, and that's a very important point to understand, if you are really very, very rich, a billionaire like Jeff Bezos, for example, or Warren Buffett, your economic income are really the corporate profits, your share of corporate profits in your business, but your reported income might be very different than that, because if you don't pay yourself dividends, if you don't realize capital gains, the reported income will be very small. The most extreme example that we cite in the book is the case of Warren Buffett, who said, explicitly, in 2015, my reported income was $10 million. And I paid only $2 million, but the fact that he paid $2 million on $10 million, that was not the relevant number. The relevant number was his income. Individual income was only 10 million when his wealth was 65 billion. The return on wealth, is this corporate profits through Berkshire Hathaway, was more like 5% of 65 billion, meaning, something like 3 billion. So he makes 3 billion in real economic terms, but he reports only 10 million because he doesn't realize many shares, and that's why his income tax is minuscule. So he's an extreme example, but you average over the top 400, and overall we find, that their reported income is only about half of their true economic income, while it is much higher for people, further down the distribution. And the second point is that in 2018, the corporate tax is much lower than it was before, because after the Trump tax cut, corporate tax payments at the federal level fell by 40%. So the big tax that the super rich are paying came down quite a bit, and that's why 2018 is exceptional in how low the tax rate at the very top is. Now, let me add something in the picture, which is health insurance. That is a big part of the political debate these days, that we tackle, from a fiscal perspective that is not, the standard way to think about it here in the United States, but that we think is useful. So, healthcare is the type of service that everybody needs, and that is expensive, and it's expensive for everybody because you get it, through highly skilled work, sophisticated technology. You look around the world in advanced economies, and there is no way to deliver cheap healthcare. No advanced economy has invented a way, to serve a population much more cheaply, than the rest. So it's essentially like K-12 education. It costs essentially the same per person. And that's why, and because it is a big cost, the same per person on average, there's no way people are going to be able to pay by themselves at the bottom of the distribution. And that's why all advanced countries except the US funded with taxes. After Obamacare, health insurance becomes mandatory, particularly on the employer side. If you have more than 50 employees, you have to provide health insurance, and therefore employers have to organize it. And actually half of the US population is covered through their employers, but on that private system, the average cost per worker is $13,000. That includes, single plans, family plans. On average, is $13K, and that's a payment that the American worker has to shoulder fully, with no direct help from the government. And so you understand that $13K might not be that much, for professors' salaries, but if you are, a low-paid worker making, $30,000 or $40,000, $13K is a huge amount. So we call those health insurance premiums a huge poll tax because it has many features of a tax. So it's something, that is taken away from your labor compensation. It's done by the private sector, and it's administered on the behalf of employers. But if you think about it as a tax, as a regressive poll tax, you immediately see that way of financing is crazy and is actually very regressive and not sustainable. And so when we add it to our picture, it looks like a big heavy bubble sitting, squarely on the shoulders of the working and the middle class. It's low at the bottom because many of those go uninsured or use Medicaid, but it becomes really huge quickly in the income distribution, and then it's small at the top because relative to their big incomes, $13K in health insurance is not that much. And we feel like that comparison is important because when you are going to compare the burden of compulsory payments across countries, the US looks like it has a low tax take, but that's in large part because people have to pay through their employer for their health care. Now, we've looked at changes in the progressivity over time. So we have that slightly, provocative chart that shows you how much the bottom 50% has paid over time compared to the 400 richest Americans. And look, it's just some accidental luck, I guess, that in 2018, that series just came down slightly relative to the bottom 50%, where we can say billionaires pay less than the working class, but you can see that the trend is clear. It used to be the case that billionaires were paying a lot more than the working class. Now they pay about the same. If you don't want to focus just on billionaires and you want a bigger group like the top 0.1%, you can do the history of that and compare to what the bottom 50% pays, and in blue, when you add those health insurance poll taxes, you get a striking picture that the top 1% used to pay a lot when you add all taxes as a fraction of their income, while the bottom 50% had a relatively low tax burden, and today they come close. And actually, if you put the healthcare insurance, essentially it's the same tax rate at the top 0.1% and for the working class. Okay? So this is a little animation. You may have seen it, through the New York Times, that shows you, decade after decade, the evolution. And clearly, 1950 was the high time, of tax progressivity, with the very rich paying more, and then a decline, especially after 1980, and if anything, at the bottom, an increase in tax rates. Okay, so why has tax progressivity collapsed? Okay, so first, there was a collapse in capital taxation that reflects changes in politics and ideology. I will talk about the corporate tax in a minute. The second was a choice to tolerate certain forms of evasion, where essentially it works like this. So the US set up a very progressive tax system that was very well enforced up to the 1960s, and then slowly avoidance started to fester as the policymaker were not as strong into enforcing the system. And particularly avoidance exploded in the 1980s. When Reagan became president, there was the rise of what was called then the tax shelter, products that essentially allowed you to buy business losses that could be used, to offset your ordinary income and reduce your income tax burden. And once evasion was so rampant, it was relatively easy for Reagan to make a deal with Congress to slash rates dramatically in exchange for closing those loopholes. During the Reagan administration, the top individual income tax rate went from 70 to 28%. So that's what happened on the individual income tax in the 2000s and the 2010s. The same happened with the corporate tax, particularly on the multinational issue that I will describe, leading very recently, finally, to the US really dramatically slashing the corporate tax at the federal level from 35 to 21%. So a lot of people think like, look, that's what globalization is about, tax havens, tax competition, we have to adapt. Our view, the strongest message we want to drive in this book is that actually there is nothing inherent in globalization that prevents capital taxation. You can structure things, in a way that would succeed in taxing capital if you really want to do it. One important point that is not very well appreciated because it was such a long time ago, but the reason why the tax rate in the top 0.1% was so high in the post-World War II decades was mostly because of the huge corporate tax that was really taxing 50% or more of all corporate profits in the economy. And while the individual income tax had an extremely progressive structure, everybody has heard, about the 90% tax rate, the action really took place at the corporate tax. That is, the tax was withheld, if you want, at source by the wealthy, on the wealthy on their corporate profits. And then it's true, after paying the tax, they may not have distributed themselves that much dividends to avoid the 90% tax rate. But in some sense, you had already taken a huge tax take. The estate tax was also more progressive. So this chart here compares the individual income tax take relative to national income to the corporate income tax. So decades earlier, the corporate income tax was raising a lot of revenue, like 5% of national income, and that really has collapsed over time, with a particularly low point here in 2018. And if you think about the corporate tax as a tax at source, on corporations, so really the most direct tax that hits the very wealthy, that explains a lot of the reduction in tax progressivity. And so it's worth looking at what happened on the corporate income tax side, to illustrate our point that you let tax evasion fester. This chart, coming from the work that Gabriel Zuckman has done, shows you the fraction of foreign profits of US multinationals booked in low tax jurisdictions, tax havens. In the 60s, almost none of the foreign profits of US multinationals was booked in those low tax places. It was booked, where the economic activity was taking place: Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Canada, etc. And you can see that over time, those numbers have changed dramatically, so that today, more than half, almost 60% of foreign profits of US multinationals is booked in very low tax jurisdiction. And so some people say, look, you know, corporations are very mobile, they move, there's nothing you can do about it. What is striking is that what moves are the paper profits, not the capital, nor the workers. Okay, so if you look at the workers, wage paid to employees in tax havens among, you know, those foreign employees of US multinationals, the numbers are very small. So what that means is that through our system of taxation, we've essentially allowed US multinationals to tell the IRS where they are making their profits. They get the help of tax accountants that help them structure things in such a way that they get claimed that a lot of their profits are made in low tax places, even though the workers, nor the buildings and the machines are there. The corporate tax is particularly important because no progressive income taxation is possible without a high enough corporate tax rate. So if we have now a low corporate tax rate of 21%, the rich will essentially incorporate their finances and retain earnings within their firm and distribute income to themselves, you know, only when they need it. So essentially, the individual income tax becomes a consumption tax. I take money out of my corporations when I need it. So Warren Buffett already was doing that. But now that we have a rate of 21%, we might see many more people, including perhaps, you know, professors giving speeches, etc., incorporating, you know, as long as they don't need the money immediately. Okay, so we think that we are at a very serious juncture here. We could see a real undermining of progressive taxation, and that's why any plan has to start with fixing the corporate tax problem and a strategy to end international tax competition. So that brings me to elements for a 21st century tax system, where we have three things, and I want to discuss briefly the one on corporate taxes, and of course, you know, we need to talk about wealth taxation on ultra wealth, and if I have time, maybe a little bit on healthcare, and those are things you can explore on the website as well. So on the corporate tax, there are relatively simple ways the US could essentially crack down on multinational tax evasion using things, you know, that already exist in an embryo form. Namely, we think the best way to tax the profits of US multinationals is to impose a minimum tax on country-by-country profits of big multinationals, because we already collect, or the IRS collects, the information of where is Google making its profit country by country and how much Google is paying in corporate taxes in each of those countries. So with a 55% minimum tax, the way it would work is that if Apple pays 2% of the profits it books in Ireland, the US would collect the missing 33%. So you can see that as a remedial tax collected by the US on its US multinationals if they manage to book, you know, profits in low tax places. So now that would put pressure on firms wanting to become non-US anymore to avoid, you know, that tax. So you need to have something. Well, first, you know, strong rules to prevent inversions, as the Obama administration actually did. But more than that, the US should also tax foreign firms if the foreign countries, such as Germany, you know, for BMW, don't do it. And the way it could be done would be based on a sales apportionment of the global tax deficit. So, for example, here we have an example. If Nestle, a Swiss company, pays only 2% globally but sells 30% of its products in the US, the US would collect the tax deficit, you know, of Nestle for 30%, you know, what corresponds to business of Nestle in the United States. It's hard to avoid and can be done by a big country unilaterally. I think, candidates are thinking plans, that have that flavor of really seriously cracking down on foreign multinational tax avoidance are going to be debated. Let me, so I should say the US can move unilaterally, but we think that international cooperation is very important. Globalization is in part, about how countries work together, and we think that the treaties on globalization are not set in stone and could be rewritten to include clauses on international agreements, on minimum taxes on corporations. That is, putting taxes at the heart of future trade deals. Taxing successfully corporations, we think, is essential for globalization to succeed, because in the current world, the biggest winners, if you want, of globalization, those big corporations that can deploy their product on the world scale very quickly, are the ones that are not paying their fair share because they can avoid taxes. So we feel like, for the perception for the broader public of globalization, it's essential to fix this issue. The US can start first unilaterally, but we think it could also succeed in putting this on the table for international agreements. Let me talk now about wealth taxation by first saying, as we describe in our book in detail, that the US is the pioneer in wealth taxation. Wealth taxes exist as far as the 17th century in America, in northern colonies in particular. So, for example, Massachusetts had taxes on wealth, not only on real estate, but also financial assets, when such taxes didn't exist, anywhere else in the world. Fight over wealth taxation is important in US fiscal history. Over a century ago, there was already a debate right here in Massachusetts about wealth taxation, where Harvard professors thought, that it'd be better to tax only housing, as Europeans were doing. And actually, they won the case, in part because the income tax started at the same time. So other colonies, there is a lot of diversity in the United States, and certainly the southern colonies really didn't like the idea of wealth taxation, because it was an existential threat for them at a time where most of the wealth in the southern colony was in the form of human beings, through slavery. The US also invented progressive income and estate taxation, so it's something that is not as well remembered as it should, but the US didn't invent the concept of a progressive income tax or a progressive inheritance tax, but the US was the first country to realize that once you have those things on the ground and working, you could crank up tax rates to levels that were just unimaginable a few years before. And the US was the first during World War II, so that's the top individual income tax rate in black, to impose rates above 50%. No country had ever done something that just a few years before would have looked, it's completely nuts to fund World War I. Then the US was also the first country to really crank up the tax rates on estates. And then it used for many years very high estate tax rates and income tax rate that I remember you here were protected with a very big corporate tax. There was essentially a tax on profits at source. And then, of course, those rates have come down. So, I say this, in those debates today about wealth taxation, imported from Europe. In reality, and we will discuss that, wealth taxes in Europe were never done well. And the reason they come in the debate here in the US at this moment, where wealth concentration is so high, is interesting. And we think it could be, the setup for yet another fiscal progressive revolution if they are implemented successfully. So that's what I want to debate, to discuss next. So you can see them as three goals, depending on where you are, on the center, to left spectrum. Nobody on the right would agree, I guess, with any of those arguments. But the first one is that they can generate revenue. Wealth is highly concentrated. There's a lot of it, so there's potentially a revenue source you could use, to fund valuable government spending. The second one, you could say, look, we've become a giant flat tax. Perhaps we should restore some progressivity as it existed to much more decades ago. Now, if you're even more left, you could say we should use the wealth tax to curb extreme wealth, because we feel that extreme wealth is corrosive to democracy. And this argument actually runs really deep in American history, something we try to emphasize in the book. But James Madison himself wrote, that great wealth, there's nothing more corrosive to democracy than great wealth. America was founded as a republic, really against the European model, aristocratic, at that time, where there would be more equality. And that theme, comes back in the US, with the progressive tax revolutions we've discussed. So in this context, you can think of the Warren wealth tax, 2% above, for wealth above 50 million and 3% above 1 billion, as a tax that likely will generate revenue sustainably. We scored it at 1% of GDP, 200 billion per year, if enforcement is successful. Bernie Sanders has proposed a more radical version of the wealth tax, particularly at the very top, where he has graduation. So the wealth tax of Warren and Bernie Sanders look very similar, up to 250 million. And then Sanders, proposes graduation 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8%, all the way to 8% above 10 billion, where the view there is that the wealth tax is designed really to substantially shrink the wealth owned by a billionaire. So let me show you effect on tax progressivity. So using our data, where we've created a database that has comprehensive income but also has wealth for each individual, we can immediately see what would be the progressivity of a wealth tax, making some assumptions on enforcement success. And with good enforcement, that is an evasion rate of 15%, that's what the Warren wealth tax, just by itself, would do to tax progressivity relative to the current system. So here, of course, it's critical that we've exploded the picture at the very top, because the wealth tax really has a dramatic effect at the very top. It essentially doubles the tax rate relative to income for the top 400. If you compare the Warren wealth tax with the Bernie Sanders wealth tax, the Bernie Sanders wealth tax is even more progressive and would have, a tripling or more of the tax rate for the top 400. Okay, so I'll discuss that with the website, but play with each tax, the individual income tax, the corporate tax, the estate tax, and very quickly you realize the wealth tax, if it is well enforced, has dramatically much more power. And for a reason that is relatively simple to understand. The income is only the flow. With the wealth, you go at the stock. So if you take a fraction of the stock, you obviously can have a dramatically more powerful impact at the very top where wealth concentrates. Okay, so we've done a little computation retrospectively looking at the Forbes 400 data. So the white is what I had shown you early on, what has happened since 1982. And then in gray, graduations of gray, we tell you what would have happened to wealth concentration if the Warren or Sanders wealth tax had been in place since 1982. And we've done that in a very simple way. You know, like every year the wealth tax would get, 3% in the Warren case of the wealth of billionaires, 5-6% in the case of Bernie Sanders. So every year you lose a fraction of your wealth, and that accumulates over time, especially if you're a billionaire for a very long time period. And then you recompute what is their total wealth, and what is, perhaps the most striking thing, this chart illustrates is that so fast or so large has been the accumulation of wealth at the top that even with wealth taxes that are not small, the top 400 would still gain in terms of their share of total U.S. wealth. They would go up to about 2%, with Warren, and even the Bernie Sanders wealth tax that on paper certainly, and is, on paper and in reality is a very dramatic progressive policy, is not enough to beat the wealth growth, if you want, of billionaire, or what we've seen historically since 1982. Okay, let me leave this for the discussion why we think a wealth tax can succeed, and let me take the few remaining minutes to present a little bit the companion tool that we've developed, that we've called taxjusticenow.org. And the idea is really to make taxes accessible to the people, because after all, if we have governments, it's in the service of the people. And taxes illustrate the fact that in our societies, we are willing to pool a significant share of our resources. So it's 28% today in the United States overall. In European countries, it'd be more like 40-45% to achieve goals, for a better, more just, and various public programs. So what we've attempted here was to let people, engage in that debate. So the way it works, what we call, fiscal democracy, is that you can change existing taxes, income, corporate, estate, change tax rates and enforcement, create new taxes, and the website tells you the impact on tax progressivity and revenue in a way that's infinitely faster than the very sophisticated and expert tools that exist in government agencies. Doug Elmendorf was running the CBO, and the CBO is really, as one of the most sophisticated tools on that. So it's much more simplistic than what CBO does, but it is much more accessible. And we've presented at CBO. We are working with government agencies, to see how do we, develop those things, to make taxes more understandable to more people. So the way the website works is that it starts with the current tax system. So here that includes health insurance as an extra tax. So that's what is that it has this shape here. Then you have rubrics at the bottom, so you can quickly construct a wealth tax. So here in this chart, you have the Warren wealth tax set at 2 and 3% here, and you can see the impact on revenue, 210 billion according to our estimates, and also how it modifies the progressivity at the top when you include all the taxes. Now, you don't have to believe our numbers. If you believe, like Larry Summers, that the evasion rate would be close to 90%, so that the tax collects only 26%, you see it's deflated quite a bit, the impact you would get on the wealth tax. And what I'm saying is that this is a legitimate debate to have. Maybe we'll discuss about it. Progressive taxes need to be enforced well to work. If you set up a tax, that has a very poor enforcement success, you don't achieve that much. Now, you can go, if you don't like wealth taxes, it's too radical, it's too strange, will never work. You can play with the individual income tax, you crank up, the individual income tax rate. So here I've set it to 45%, and you can see, yes, it does something, but it doesn't do a ton right here at the top, because these people at the very top don't have that much ordinary income. But now you can tax capital gains fully, etc., have more options. So another thing we do on the website using our levers is that we model the candidates' tax plans, at least the three main ones, based on what they've announced so far in terms of tax policy, which is only a partial view. It's evolving constantly, but here is the picture you get, as of October 10 or 12, when we did this. There hasn't been very major announcements since then in terms of tax policy, but relative to and so that includes health insurance in taxes. So the Joe Biden plan is a number of things to increase tax rates on the rich, to bring us back some way, to where it was under the Obama administration. So it looks small here relative to the others, but this is, significant increase, So it is the type of variation we've seen in recent decades between Republican and Democratic administration. Now you can see that Warren is much more radical, and especially Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, would take 97% of the income of the top 400, but you have to understand that this is not confiscating their income, because there is such a big wealth tax. Even before you've earned a single dollar, if you're a billionaire, you have to pay a huge wealth tax. And of course, then you earn income, but what this tells you is that the income those billionaires are making are about the same, as the wealth tax you have to pay to start with. So that's how you achieve such enormous rates. At the bottom here, and it's something, we want to emphasize, because Warren and Sanders remove the private health insurance, that private tax disappears, so it's converted into wages. It's effectively a big tax cut for the middle class, but then obviously, that money then has to be, that insurance has to be paid for by the government. And so Bernie Sanders increases taxes, throughout, enough to replace, the current private health insurance. Warren looks like it's very low tax throughout, because currently her tax increases are not enough to pay, for the replacement of health insurance. So that's why when you put, the Warren plan on our website, it comes as a negative 2% of national income. That is, her taxes don't cover the full replacement of the private health insurance as it currently exists. But you don't even have to wait for Elizabeth Warren to propose her policy. You can go on the website and complete a tax plan, for yourself, and engage with the candidates. So let me finish by repeating. The widely held view that external or technical constraints make tax justice impossible, we believe, is wrong. We can do progressive taxation with globalization. Tolerating tax evasion is a choice, and there is essentially an infinity of possible future policy paths. That is, US tax progressivity can be destroyed if we go down the road, of the very low corporate tax rate. Other candidates are proposing, really dramatic, radical increases in tax progressivity. So we believe that economists can be helpful in making possibilities concrete, explain how the current tax system works. So that's what we've tried to do with this book and with the website. And then at a more technical level, we view the role of tax experts, such as ourselves, in helping, making sure the plumbing is done well if there is a political will to do more progressive taxes. So we take our motto from Esther Duflo, who won the Nobel Prize 2 weeks ago and said, wrote a paper for the AEA LE lecture, economists as plumbers. In the case of progressive taxation and fixing leaks, literally that's what we tax experts should be doing in this case. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Emmanuel, for this very, very interesting talk, raising so many questions. So we will start with a short Q&A. I have prepared a few questions, which I hope many of you are asking yourselves, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Okay, so you mentioned that wealth taxes have been abandoned in many European countries. You did not say why you think that they could actually possibly succeed in the US.
I just want to put the slide here, just so that I am more clear.
Is your microphone?
Yeah. So wealth taxation. So a lot of the debate has been, will they work? And detractors have make the important, important point to consider that they've been tried in Europe, and by and large they failed. Meaning that European countries have abandoned them, and where they continue, they really don't raise that much revenue. It's the Larry Summers, graph. It's really a sliver at the top, essentially because those wealth taxes don't go after a bulk of the existing wealth at the top. So why do we think that they could work in the United States? So we lay out three elements. So European wealth taxes failed because of tax competition, that is fears that people would move to other countries. In France, certainly in the debates, there was a fear that wealthy French people would move to Belgium or to London. And indeed in Europe, just moving to another country extinguishes the wealth tax, for France, because taxes in Europe are based on residence. But that choice is a policy choice, and the US has made a radically different choice, to actually tax its citizens no matter where they are. And even, imposing an exit tax, very substantial, which is a one-time huge wealth tax, 40%, roughly speaking, if you decide to renounce your citizenship and your high income or high wealth. So you can see that just with this different system, you essentially kill a lot of the potential response on the mobility front. On the second issue was offshore evasion. It was very easy in Europe to put your wealth in, say, Swiss banks, because the Swiss banks didn't have any obligation to report to the French tax authorities. And we had the famous case, of the Minister of Finance under the socialist government, who himself, had a foreign, had a Swiss bank account, and he had to resign, in disgrace. Now, the US is different because the US has actually taken, a very bold step under the Obama administration in 2010 with the FATCA, Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. So think about FATCA, for the acronym, that forces any foreign institution to report accounts of their US residents, and this has bite. Actually, if you're a US person, it's hard now to open an account abroad because there are all those extra reporting requirements. But that would make offshore tax evasion a lot harder. The final thing that is important is the exemption threshold. So if you want the genius of the candidates this year, was to present the wealth tax as really a tax on ultra wealth, 50 million or 32 million exemption level, while the European taxes started much lower than that, like 1 million. And therefore, the French wealth taxes had the problem that, or the European wealth taxes, that they were hitting people who were, merely millionaires, but might be there, because they had a valuable house, a valuable plot of land, but without really liquidity or income to pay the wealth tax. At 50 million and above, the liquidity problems vanish, at least if you believe the financial markets work for the ultra wealthy.
Great. Okay, I think the other questions will be quicker to answer, actually. So some people wrote that the Warren tax proposal will only raise 25 billion in revenue. You said it would raise around 250 billion.
Yes.
So what explains the
Yes.
difference?
So it's exactly this. That is, if you don't do those things right, Larry Summers is right to say that the tax might fail entirely if they do huge exemptions for some asset classes, and the rich can then put their wealth in there. The wealth tax yield could be very small. Our point is that the avoidance evasion rate is not a law of nature. So it's not like we're right and Larry Summers is wrong. It will depend on how the thing is legislated and how much enforcement effort is put.
Another thing that's been very much discussed in the debate is that you don't include transfers when you look at disposable income, especially at the bottom. And so wouldn't this really affect your measures of tax progressivity? You show it's very flat, almost regressive.
Yes. So this is a good point. Governments raise taxes. That's what we study. And then, of course, they use those taxes for a number of useful public spending. And that spending is progressive. It gives Medicare for the old, Medicaid for the poor, EITC for the working class, etc., etc. And therefore, in net, even if you have just a giant flat tax, but you spend it in a progressive way, the role of the government is redistributed. And indeed, in our work, we've also distributed, and CBO also does it, the transfers, and it dramatically increases the progressivity of the overall system. But here, this is a book about taxes, and for us, taxes mean something. Even though for an economist to think only about a budget constraint, the tax is not well defined. But here we think the economists are actually missing something. Taxes mean something to people. That's what we study, and a tax is a payment from people or businesses to the government, and that's what we get now. That's what we do. Some, like CBO, do distribute the EITC that they consider like a negative tax. So instead of the individual income tax being small like this, it's actually a negative. So it carves out a big hole here, so that effectively, and plus they don't consider this, the state and local taxes, so they do find much more progressivity. So it's not like we're right, they are wrong again. We don't look at the same thing. We think on principles. We just look at taxes. And when you just look at taxes, payment in one direction, that's what you get. There's no question. And we totally agree that if you were to add transfers, then the overall system looks a lot more progressive.
Shouldn't we be worried that if we tax, wealthy people, that the economic pie is going to shrink because there will be less entrepreneurship, less work? Aren't you worried about these?
Yes. I spent many years of my life trying to tackle this question. So I guess I must have been worried that
and in fact, we
be so obsessed about
that
it.
work.
And we teach that. So that's the classic economist view. People are motivated by financial incentives, financial rewards. So you make the rewards smaller because of taxation. Are they going to work less? So there is an enormous literature in economics that we teach, year after year. What does the literature say? For sure, there is strong evidence that especially high-income earners, will go to great lengths to try to avoid or evade the tax if there are opportunities to avoid it. And there is an industry of tax accountants that helps them do that. In terms of, are they going to work less? That one, in my view, you know, I haven't seen a smoking gun showing you that people, especially people at the top, work a lot less when taxes are higher. And at a very intuitive level, you know, for us academics, it's obvious that it's not the pure financial incentives. I don't do my research just to get a bigger pay from UC Berkeley. I do my research to get the world, you know, excited about the ideas. And in terms of businesses, I think it's the same. When you set up a business, it's not just the money and the consumption you will get for you and your heirs. It's also about making an impact, a difference in the world. This is controversial, you know, it's not something we capture very well with our economic model. There's a lot of work, and that work should continue. If there is a wealth tax, I'm sure, you know, many papers down the road will try to study that question.
So we will see if the pie shrinks. Okay. I heard that you said healthcare premia are actually a regressive tax. What I couldn't necessarily understand is why other things like, you know, food and clothing or other expenses, why are they not considered a sort of regressive tax since everybody needs to buy those too?
Yes. So this is a good question. So healthcare is different because as a society we've said everybody needs it. There's almost a consensus for everybody in our society should have healthcare. Now, healthcare on the cheap doesn't exist. It's true that everybody needs to eat, everybody needs clothing, but you have a really wide range of possibilities in terms of budgets for eating and for clothing. In the case of healthcare, you don't see that possibility. People have to go to hospitals, doctors, treat for heart attack, etc. So the minimum cost of healthcare is very high. And once you say everybody needs healthcare, the cost is high, it's not going to work to ask every person to pay for it. And the US currently asks the workers to pay for it, you know, through their employer, and that's the point we're making here. It's not sustainable, and seeing it as a tax helps explain why this is historically many things. The welfare state often starts as agreement between employers and workers through their unions that start like this, you know, as contributions and eventually morph into taxes. So it's not quite a tax, but it's evolving towards a tax, and if Medicare for All happens, it will become a true tax.
Great. I want to open it up because I'm sure you have many questions. So.
Yeah, hi. So this is very interesting. About the size of pie argument, so what about, you were completely free, you have limited budget of, sorry, about the size of pie argument, you were completely free, or you had the limited budget of, you know, macroeconomic impacts, but so what about just in the simplest macroeconomic model, so if you increase capital tax rates from, say, 0% or 40% to 40%, you know, with a Cobb-Douglas share of 2/3, 1/3, you're going to have 60% less capital, and then the aggregate wages will be 30% less big. So does that make you, do we say we don't care because it's all about the relative income, or it's still, you know, 30% fewer wages, less wages is kind of bad? What do you think, Matt?
So economists, by and large, believe that taxing capital is bad. It's bad because people will save less, therefore there will be less capital in the economy, less buildings, less machines, and therefore workers will be less productive. Now, I want to look at the evidence. And we know, you know, you are a behavioral economist, and if behavioral economics has succeeded in doing something, is to show us, you know, that this model for intertemporal preferences, I save because of the return, my future consumption, really goes very, very wrong. And our view of the evidence is that there isn't a lot of link between how much you tax capital, that's the black line here, and how much people save. That's the gray line, on private savings. If you look at how societies organize saving, you can see that for the bottom 90%, it's a lot through institutions. Pension systems, defaults, whether employers are required to set up pensions for their employees. For students, student loans, that has a dramatic negative effect, of course, on wealth if you have to pay up front and borrow. And housing, the mortgage invention, the 30-year mortgage invention, is a great tool to increase savings. So we are not worried about that. We have to look at the capital stock, decide as a society if it's too small, and if it is too small, there are policies we can do. So in the end, it's not savings per se, it's more, will the really talented people deploy their talent to build the new companies, make the economy work better? That's the core question, and I think, in my view, we don't know that much about it, but I haven't seen evidence to tell us that it would kill those incentives to do anything.
Many say that it's hard to measure wealth, that the different kinds. Many say it's hard to measure wealth, that there are many different kinds of wealth, and that this would be fatal to, or very problematic for wealth tax.
Yes. So the issue. So that's the issue of enforcement of the wealth tax, which is an issue we take seriously. We think it can be done well. At a very high level, here is the reason. In the US, in an advanced economy like the US, we have well-defined property rights. That is, we know who owns what. And second, human societies know really the value of things. You know whether a business is valuable or not, and the financial sector is there supposedly to put values on those businesses. So I don't see any technological constraint that would prevent discovering the price of most assets. A lot of assets are already traded on markets: corporate equity, publicly traded, bonds, fixed claim. Private equity, meaning businesses that are not publicly traded, is one of the hardest, and there we think there are ways to make it work. What we propose in the book is to say, if the IRS and the business person don't agree on a valuation, the business person has the opportunity to pay in shares, meaning in kind, and then the IRS would resell the shares. So it's essentially the government creates the missing market. But remember, what helps us here is that wealth at the very top is highly divisible, precisely because it's organized through corporations that have shares that divide the value of the business. So now, of course, you have to be careful in enforcement. People would try to cheat, to trust, dissimulate the wealth, but if enforcement is strong, we don't think that's unsurprising.
The gentleman
Yes.
with the microphone, and then we get to.
You said that globalization doesn't prevent progressive tax per se. Now, what about the other way around? Doesn't progressive taxing affect globalization? Because globalization is not neutral. It has incentives. And one of the incentives is that it offers lower taxes in some places. So now that you have higher taxes, because if the other country tax 2%, the country that's applying the tax, applies the other 23%. So what happens is they don't go there, or maybe they go there because there is a low payment for employees. But then the other country offers lower taxes when you keep the employees here in the country. So that creates a chain of reaction. I wonder if you also thought about that. But quickly, about the health tax being aggressive tax, I'm amazed that you didn't bring the comment that the health insurance is not used all the time. You use it mostly when you are sick, and sometimes you can avoid it and not incur too many risks. So in that sense, it's really a aggressive task, I think.
Yeah, so let me talk about the first one on globalization. So if the US were to follow our corporate tax plan, namely the Apple, the Googles, would have to pay no matter where they book their profits because they are US companies, are we at risk that Chinese companies would replace Apple because maybe those Chinese companies don't pay much corporate tax? So that's why we have the defensive tax that says if you do business in the United States, meaning that you sell stuff in the United States will make sure you pay your share so that the US companies that are not at a disadvantage. Now, and that, in the end, if you do that, you know, okay, the Chinese companies have to pay, the US companies have to pay, we need to reduce incentives for business development. That goes back to the question we discussed earlier. Will Apple, because now it has to pay more taxes on its profits, decide, well, this is not worth it anymore, you know, the executives or class, etc. That's the issue of the economic incentive. At the end, will people work less, do less, if their taxes are higher at the upfront? That's a key underlying question.
Yes. First, I'd like to put a big plug in for your book, which is terrific. It's very, very readable.
This was not commissioned.
And distills all the stuff that's been done by you guys, Piketty and you and Zuckman. So I wanted to follow up on something you said, which is that your book and your work seems to be really oriented toward income tax, and that it's flat and how you're going to reform it. And it's very complicated, as you point out. Wealthy people divert their incomes and change the nature of it. You have to go after that. Are you doing that because right now income is the way to attack this issue? Because if you did if you really focused on wealth is really much cleaner. Wealth is wealth. I mean, you really can't transform it. It is or it isn't. And do you think ultimately, in other words, we're going to really focus on the wealth tax and kind of let this stuff get out of the picture? These regressive sales taxes and payroll taxes and things like that. Is that what you're aiming for, or you really want to stick with income and we're going to struggle with it?
So what we did, something I didn't have time to discuss, but we think those consumption taxes, right, they are an archaic form of taxation. It'd be better to replace them. A VAT value-added tax, as they have in Europe, would be better because it would tax services, but even a VAT relative to income would look pretty regressive because people at the top don't consume as large a fraction of their income. Now, if I understand you correctly, you may be telling us, you know, that income is not the unique measure of ability to pay. Wealth should also factor in. So wealth factors in income to the extent that you get a return on wealth, but maybe that's not enough. Maybe if your wealth is really big, it gives you more ability to pay over and above the income it generates. So it's the question of how should we rank people. Here we followed the standard of ranking by income. That is done in part because most taxes are based on income, but other presentations are possible, and it's true that if you were to add wealth in ability to pay, the regressivity at the top would be even starker.
Hi, so I have another side of the pie question. I know that we're taught in economics that we want to think about the evidence that shows that some very high earners might be affected by high taxes, but isn't there evidence to show that on the lower end of the spectrum, if folks have more opportunity, if there's more wealth in a social system that provides for opportunities for people to start small businesses, to go to school, to live better lives, do we have any evidence that shows how that impacts the overall size of the economy?
So this is a good question. I think the best answer, the one that we at least try to give in the book, is a contrast of the US in the post-World War II decades, when the economy was working for everybody, with very high taxes at the top, versus what has happened since 1980, where the economy is not working for the bottom 50%. And I agree with you, income stagnating at the bottom 50% is not going to end well. And perhaps the reason we are in such a crazy political environment has something to do with this inequity issue. Coming back to the other question I got about corporate taxes, yes, countries not only compete on where it is cheapest to do business, but also where do you have the best workers, an educated workforce. And certainly, when I'm thinking about my state of California, California has high taxes, but nevertheless succeeds in attracting a lot of bright young people to come to my school, the University of California, Berkeley, and other campuses, and then stay in California. And that, I think, is more powerful than the taxes because it comes first. You want to help the people when they don't have yet the liquidities, when they don't have yet the education. The wealth tax, the advantage of the wealth tax is that it takes from you once you have succeeded, not when you are planning how do I succeed.
Emmanuel, thank you for a great talk. I want to harken back to something that you mentioned at the beginning of the talk, which had to do with the motivation for writing this book, which is really to translate some of your research insights into a form that's accessible for a general audience. There are a number of graduate students here, undergrads and junior faculty too. I'd like to know if you could speak to us with respect to what's like a new vision for like research that translates, because oftentimes as economists we're taught to think about being very positive and not being normative. So if you can speak to that question.
So this is a very general question. My sense or my advice this time, as an older academic, is that I would recommend that you look carefully at the world around you, and when you think about what are my research questions, it's better to work based on what you see as the big issues that you may read in the press, see in the debate, rather than responding to existing research. It's more likely to be about something that's more relevant. And then if you do something that's relevant in the current debate, it's not too hard to translate it to a broader audience. My feel, and maybe that's would be considered as too much of a criticism of economics, is that if you can't really translate what you're doing for a broader audience, I worry that what you might have found you might not capture very well or be that relevant for what's going on in the world. But now, I'm extreme that way. Many colleagues would not like me saying this, but that's based, I was a young Harvard assistant professor. Now, 20 years later, that's the conclusion I conclude.
I'm delighted to hear what you just said. I'm not an economist, so I don't have quite the same pressures, but thank you. My question is about the politics. I'm a political scientist, of course, which is, how do we get to there, exactly what the there is from here? If I remember my history in your earlier drafts, we instituted an income tax around World War I, taxes were high around World War II, and so on. So one answer is a big international war in which everybody rallies around, the public fist and so on. That probably is not the recommendation you'd make or that I'd make. But more generally, we don't have a population that sees inequality as the highest. If you look at the most important problem kinds of questions on surveys, inequality is there, but gun control or climate change or freedom of speech or whatever often ends up higher. Inequality is not a primary driving, motivating force in the public arena, at least if we believe survey data. And what you're talking about, even with these kinds of extraordinarily wonderful websites, still feels pretty abstract, right? It's going to be, it's a lot of numbers, it's going to take a long time, there's an awful lot of leakage, my kids aren't going to, my kids need a job, right? higher taxes or higher, et cetera. So how do we think about the politics of this?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm the economic expert. But what I would say, though, is that there is perhaps more fervor than you think about the issue of concentration of income and wealth. So, for example, Piketty sold, I think, millions of books, and this was a thick, really big a book. So candidates are making really bold proposals specifically on these issues. So my view is that societies change quickly. If this becomes, if bold policy proposals are made, candidates are elected, the picture of taxation can change dramatically very quickly. Historically, you're right that it took very serious crises, wars, Great Depression, to really change the picture, but we've learned that fiscal revolutions, progressive fiscal revolutions, are possible. So let's hope that for the next one, we don't need such a deep or serious crisis.
Since we're almost out of time, there's 2 questions. You can just ask them quickly, one after the other, and then Emmanuel will respond quickly at the same time.
So you brought up Warren Buffett, and one of the main things about his wealth is that he's committed a good chunk of it to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and those are services that the government is not necessarily going to provide. So I'm wondering how you think about a wealth tax and what the U.S. government is going to do with that revenue versus a broader public good that might be provided better by philanthropic private agents.
Yes, I should take the other.
So thank you for your talk, and I'm sorry to ask this question at Harvard, but I was curious what your thoughts on are endowment taxes.
Go very well together.
I am ambushed at the last minute to talk about the Harvard. So, look, coming from France, I think the non-profit sector in the US is wonderful, and it shows you that non-profit motives can make you achieve great things. There is an issue, though, of great fortunes being made and not paying taxes at all, or hardly at all, and then going into private charity. So we have to find the right way about how do you make those fortunes contribute also to, in part, to society through the government. And the same goes with the Harvard endowment. What we are learning from those endowments, is that with sophisticated investment advice, you can get a rate of return that beats the economy. R bigger than G is true for an infinitely lived or a very long-lived institution like Harvard University.
Yeah.
Yes, and that is going to raise issues. Humans have finite life. The fact that R is bigger than G ends up in an equilibrium with those big funds, Harvard, but also sovereign funds like Norway has, or other oil countries have. I think is going to raise an issue. Somehow you don't see how this equilibrates itself.
Great. So on this joyful note for Harvard's endowment, thank you very much. Join me in thanking Emmanuel for
Thank you.